This week on Q&A, Pulitzer Prize-winning Washington Post columnist Walter Pincus discusses his career as a reporter, along with current issues of national security.
Walter Pincus of the Washington Post, you wrote on July 24th, 2012, "Is Congress a serious legislative body or not?" What's your answer?
Well, part of it is my terrible history in which, when I was in my 20s, I worked in the Senate for Senator Fulbright, running an investigation. It's a totally different body, totally different. And it has become so polarized that it doesn't work. And something's got to change.
What did you do for Senator Fulbright and what committee?
The Senate Foreign Relations Committee. I had written a magazine article, I hate to say it, in 1960 on foreign government lobbying. And he called up the next year and said, "You pointed out weaknesses in the Foreign Agent Registration Act. Do you want to come to the committee for 18 months and change the law?" And I was 28 years old and fancy-free and writing for 3 North Carolina papers and magazines, and the idea of changing the law was tempting.
Did you get it done?
We investigated for 6 months. We held 2 months of hearings, and it took another few months to change the law, and we did. Foreign Agent Registration Act registration is probably still one of the best lobbying registration acts on the book.
How's it work?
If you represent a foreign government or foreign government entity, you have to register, and then you have to file reports every 6 months. How you spent your money, who got money over a certain amount. They fooled with it somewhat because they're worried about government corporate entities. And I think in the years after I left, I got some waiver into that. But it's still a pretty good, nobody goes to look at it, but it's there to look at, like a lot of stuff in town.
If I count right, in December of this year, you'll be 80.
Christmas Eve, yeah.
Why are you still writing a couple of times a week for the Washington Post?
Because I love doing it, and I'm doing it for an institution I love, and for people I just love working with. And I think when I first started out, I belonged to a generation went into reporting to try to change things. And I've been lucky enough all these years to be free most of the time to write what I want to write and to try to make things better.
So what are your arrangements with the Post? What's your title?
I'm a reporter. But I'm also, part of my strange life, I'm also a consultant to the corporation because as part of this ridiculous background, I was once half owned by either CBS or NBC and worked on television.
So what kind of consulting do you do?
I talked to the editor, Marcus Broccoli, the other day about how the paper's going and what maybe we could do better. And I talked to Catherine Weymouth, who's the publisher, and occasionally talked to Don Graham, who runs the company, about things I think we might be able to do better.
So as a columnist, and you call yourself a columnist, or because you do give your opinion sometimes.
Well, I've been a reporter so long, I have a little card that says I'm a reporter. Yeah, I have written a column for the last 2.5, 3 years, and it is a different category. I still occasionally try to write news stories, but everybody's worried I give my opinion too much. The column gives me a kind of freedom that I haven't had before, and it lets you sort of build on the past.
How many different newspapers have you worked for?
I started as a copy boy in the New York Times. I was in a training program after I got out of the Army for the Wall Street Journal. I wrote for I was the Washington correspondent for 3 small North Carolina papers. I worked for the Washington Star, and then Ben hired me in 1966 for the Post. And then for, I guess, 4 years or so, I tried to start a newspaper, which failed publicly, which was a great experience. And then I was the executive editor of the New Republic for several years, and we were going to buy the New Republic, and then Marty Peretz came along and bought it, and I came back to the Post.
I have a stack of your columns, not the last 3-4 months, and before I though read some of this and get you to comment on them, what do you consider your beat?
I think it's what I call sort of national security, but it's national security is not just the Pentagon and the intelligence agencies, CIA, etc., but the Hill and the public at large. I mean, it's spread all over the place, but essentially I focus on national security.
Before we head into this, when did you start law school?
I started law school in 1992. No, I started in 1995.
Why?
Ben Bradley and Kay Graham both retired at 70. And,
at the Post?
At the Post. Both my parents lived to 95. My father ran a company, and when I didn't go into it, he retired at 62 and lived for 33 more years. And so I figured I had, after 70, a lot of years left. I had covered the law a lot. I liked the law. I have a lot of friends who are lawyers. I have an older son. And so I thought I'd get a law degree and practice law.
Did you?
I graduated in 2001. I flunked the bar, which came right after Kay Graham's funeral, and we were ushers. That was my excuse. The war had kind of started, and Don Graham said I could stay as long as I wanted, so I've taken him up on it.
What did it feel like, by the way, getting your law degree and then flunking the bar? I know that happens to a lot of people.
It was strange. I stopped going to the... I hadn't taken almost 10 courses that were on the bar review, the DC bar, and then I went to bar review in the morning and went back to work in the afternoon. All the kids I was with were busy studying, and I don't know, I was disappointed. I had had a couple offers from law firms, but I think they wanted me to do PR rather than the law. I love the law. The law was it was a great experience. I have a whole bunch of experiences that didn't turn out to be what they were supposed to be, and a couple failed, but you learn from all of it. And it took me 6 years going part-time and still working, but it was a great experience.
Undergraduate at Yale at 54?
Class of 54.
1954, and then in 2001 a law degree from Georgetown. Here's a column, June 27th. I'll just read a little bit. The State Department is planning to spend up to $115 million to upgrade the U.S. Embassy compound in Baghdad. Already its biggest and most expensive in the world, according to pre-solicitation notices published this month. That was back in June. You say here, remember, it has been 3.5 years since the American diplomats moved into the 104-acre, $700 million facility, and only 4 months after the State Department in February talked about trying to cut back the U.S. presence there. Why did that get your attention? One of the things I focused on, because we are in financial trouble, is the way we have spread money around, not so much in foreign aid, although aid in Iraq and Afghanistan much too extensive.
But building things that we know we're not going to need 5 or 10 years down the road. It's a big story today in the paper about what we've done in Afghanistan. You know, hundreds of millions of dollars of construction that these people can't possibly sustain. It's a lesson that was hammered home during the Iraq period, and yet we keep doing it.
Why do you think?
We do it because we think we're giving something to the people, but we don't understand. We're trying to make them like us and do things that we would want done. I mean, as I've thought back over time, I keep going back to the I worked for Fulbright twice. I went back in 69, 70, and in effect investigated the war in Vietnam, the military and foreign policy. And the lessons that he taught me stick with me now. And one of the things he told me in the first years was, if you don't understand the domestic problems of the country you're dealing with, you can't have a good foreign policy, because all foreign policy is domestic, including ours. So we do things that people here think ought to be done, and we don't think enough about what the people we're dealing with want done, what their leaders are facing. And it's not done evilly, it's just done because we don't think enough.
Here's another sentence from that column. The United States has spent about $100 million on the police college facility, having built living quarters, a dining facility, an office building, a new gymnasium, and a helicopter landing site. At year's end, the facility will be turned over to the Iraqis because it's the State Department, did not get land rights use for more than 1 year.
The State Department people are a little upset about that, and it's literally what was said in the document I talked about. There's an argument about whether they had or had not land rights. The thing that got me about it was we built a facility that our police would want. But it's nothing like the facility that the Afghan police are used to, nor that they would sustain when we left.
How do you spend $100 million on a police facility?
A lot of it is they have security around the whole thing. So you got to build guard posts, all sorts of technical stuff. I mean, I'm always amazed at the amount of money we spend abroad and how little we spend here. It's become an issue politically in this country more and more as we have to cut back. But this is money that's poured into the Pentagon to do things that you couldn't do in any domestic program because people look harder at it. But the defense budget is so big that, you know, my favorite is we've cut it. We spent $1.5 million a year on military bands. We just built a $4 million facility for the Army Materiel Command Band that had to move from Belvoir down to Huntsville, Alabama.
Fort Belvoir here in the suburbs.
And they built a $4 million facility for the band, which is about 40 people. And it's got, you know, separate rooms for everybody. I mean, if you spent $4 million on an elementary school, I bet somebody would raise questions.
This is a column from July the 2nd. It's kind of in the same vein. Why doesn't the Iraq government seem to like us? ? Why won't Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki give better treatment to the U.S. government officials whose military freed Iraq from Saddam Hussein and whose employees now are trying to make this country better? Why are we giving more than $1 billion next year, mostly to Iraq's military, which, while its oil income has soared, supposedly putting the Baghdad regime in surplus?
I mean, this is part of my, I get worried I sound more and more conservative or isolationist. But this is more the understanding that having created a democracy in Iraq, we are not popular. And therefore, Maliki, to hold on to his support, can't be too pro-American, even though we did all that for him. And it's something we have to understand, but we then keep putting money in, less money now this year in Iraq. But it's to try to make people understand, in effect, that money doesn't buy you support. You've got to understand the politics of that country. And in a lot of countries in the Middle East, we weren't like before, we're not like now, although we have helped them. And part of it has nothing to do with our help. It has to do with their politics. And underlying a lot of the Middle East is the Arab-Israeli problem and our siding with the Israelis.
Is anybody watching this expenditure?
A lot of, when it comes to defense, very few people. This whole argument about, they have actually cut $487 billion over the next 10 years, but that's a reduction for only 1 year. The cost, nobody's analyzed the cost of this spectacular army we have created, which is all volunteer, and which costs an enormous amount of money.
You have, in this July 2nd column, this paragraph, USAID, by the way, what is USAID?
The Agency for International Development Foreign Aid.
Plans to spend $263 million next year to support Iraq government building and anti-corruption programs. The bulk of fiscal 2013 money for Iraq, $911 million, is in a new foreign military financing fund run by the State Department to continue Pentagon programs that developed Iraqi Army professionalism and logistics capabilities. State already has $850 million for FMF in fiscal 2012 money, and at this point, people listening are saying, what was that all about?
Well, we are building up, to some degree from the ground up, the Iraqi army. They are now our sort of military allies. And a lot of people will say, well, they're buying American equipment, so this is, in effect, a program that helps American industry, the military-industrial complex, sell weapons. I have mixed feelings about building up armies in the Middle East that you have no control over. And you have no control eventually over those weapons and what happens to them. The anti-corruption thing is, it's very funny. We have a whole series of prosecutions going on in this country for our military, who made deals and kickbacks on some of these programs. And then we talk about other countries being corrupt. But we call them corrupt. The Iraqis saw what our people were doing. So we didn't set a great example there. We don't set a great example anywhere.
What was your position on going into Iraq in the first place?
I guess I wrote that I thought it was, I was a reporter in those days, and the so-called famous piece was 2 days before the war started, writing a piece that raised questions about whether there was WMD in Iraq. Because people both in the Pentagon and the agency had told me they weren't sure. But the intelligence was cherry-picked. I mean, the Bush administration wanted to go in. And if that wasn't the excuse, they would have found another one.
If you were inside the Oval Office in those very private conversations, what do you think their reason was?
I think, like all White Houses, there's no one reason. In this case, there were several different reasons. And you had a president who, I think, felt he needed to do something dramatic. People forget where we were politically. I mean, at that point, President Bush had previously made a big thing about catching Osama bin Laden. That hadn't been done. And this became an alternative, and they had very subtly, beginning in August of 2002, been selling the idea that somehow there was a connection between Saddam Hussein and 9/11, which still was then and still is a big thing in this country.
When you hear people, the conspiracy theorists, say it was oil, what kind of is there any truth to that?
No, I don't. I think, some people may have thought that. I mean, there were groups starting with Wolfowitz and some other people, Paul Wolfowitz, who was deputy at the Pentagon, who, going back to the original Gulf War, had wanted to go and knock Saddam Hussein off even then. I've written once, twice, or three times about a presentation he made to the House Budget Committee in February, before the March invasion, in which he said, unlike Afghanistan, if you go into Iraq, you'd get all these benefits. First of all, they had oil, they could pay for anything that happened. Secondly, they're the most educated people in the Middle East. It would become democratic. Of course, he was talking about the Sunni minority, not the Shia majority. He said it'd become a democracy, and democracies don't attack each other, therefore wouldn't attack Israel. It was change its approach to Israel.
Go back to this embassy in Iraq. You say that they're going to spend. Have they committed to spending $115 million more on the embassy?
Their argument. Talked to the secretary. I talked to the deputy secretary
of defense.
Of state. And what's happened is, partially because of the security situation, they had to bring more people who were going to be out in the country, in consulates and elsewhere, into Baghdad. And therefore there are going to be more people there than they originally expected. And so they had to expand.
So they will have spent $815 million on the embassy in Iraq, which was the largest one we've ever built anywhere in the world.
Yeah.
And no one questions this.
Well, I think people along the way questioned it, but there's so much else going on. It's a big, I don't know, it's become such a big government, and it will eventually come around to my feeling about the media not doing what it really ought to do, and that is keep track of all these things. We spend a lot of time and space covering press conferences and what people say, and we spend not enough time, in my view, what's really going on.
How do you do it?
The way I've always done it is reading documents. I mean, there's a huge amount of public material that's put every day out in the public record, and people don't read it. The key to the column, whether it's good or not, is documents. I try to base every column on something I read, a transcript, a report, a hearing, whatever.
You try to be different than everybody else?
Well, I started out with these 3 North Carolina papers, so I had to compete with the Associated Press and the other wire services, so you're always looking for things other people aren't doing. So I've never, lucky enough, so I've never been a beat reporter, really. I've always been able to go out on my own.
You write in the Washington Post. Everybody in Washington, not everybody, but most people read it here. Will everybody take your phone call? All the people in government?
Yeah. The other part of doing what I've been doing for as long as I've been doing, and it's another part of the new culture. When I start off, sort of old people talk. When I start off, there were a bunch of reporters, young reporters. We used to meet once a month and have dinner with somebody in government and meet them outside the arena so that you got to know people who were in government in a three-dimensional sense rather than just the person who stands up at the podium or gives a press conference or makes a statement. And then if you do it as long as I use as an example all the time, gets me embarrassed. I mean, I met George Tenet when he was the legislative assistant to Jack Heinz, a senator from Pennsylvania. I met Les Aspin when he just went to work for McNamara in the Kennedy administration.
He went on to be Secretary of Defense.
Secretary of Defense. George became CIA director. I met Leon Panetta when he was a congressman. I met Don Rumsfeld when he was at OEO. He became Defense Secretary.
Office of Economic Opportunity.
And you sort of stay in touch. And the other part about being a journalist is, unlike lawyers and doctors and other professionals, I mean, journalism is a profession, what we do is write out there. So they see what you've done. And some people I got to know very well, I got in terrible trouble. But after the trouble was over...
name someone that you got in terrible trouble.
Well, Claire George, who was the Deputy Director of Operations for CIA, I wrote the stories that got him indicted, and he was eventually convicted. And I was at his retrial, had a retrial. Everybody was talking to him, and he'd never answered a phone call, never done anything. And when the rest of the press went away, I walked up and introduced myself, and Claire said, 6 months after this is over, give me a call. And so he was convicted, then he was pardoned, and in December, and in June I called him up, and we had lunch, or breakfast, at the Shoreham, and became good friends.
And again, what had he done wrong, or did he do anything wrong if he was pardoned?
He was pardoned by George Bush along with everybody else in Iran-Contra. What he had done wrong was he had not told what he knew about the payments to get the hostages out of Iran. He knew it. He was at a hearing. They asked him about it, and he didn't say it. So he was convicted for withholding information from Congress.
Here's a column, June 20th. At last, after 11 years of the United States at war, a few minutes of public discussion of a tax to pay for the fighting, but that would be for the next war. How was it? Did we fight the war in Iraq, and I assume Afghanistan, without paying for it?
This is, to me, one of the worst things that happened associated with the Bush war in Iraq, and that is not only the failure to pay for it, first war in American history where there was no extra tax, but a tax cut. He had instituted a tax cut, initiated the war, and in that same period of time, they withdrew the last remaining excise tax that had helped pay for the Korean War on telephone tax. But the idea, they weren't going to put a tax to pay for the war because the Congress wouldn't have passed it.
Where were the Democrats?
Well, the Democrats were as afraid as everybody else was, because of the aura that had been created about the threat from Saddam Hussein.
But
My memory is the only people who really raised an issue was the Congressional Black Caucus in the House about going to war. The Democrats were worried that at the first Gulf War they had opposed it, and it turned out to be the right thing to do.
But if you look back at the Iraq War that started in 2003, I think it was Larry Lindsey, who was the economic advisor for George Bush, who said this is not going to cost $60 billion, it's going to cost $200 billion. Of course, it's up to $1 trillion or something like that. The other one was Eric Shinseki, who said that it was going to take more than 150,000 troops or whatever, and they both lost their jobs.
This was a huge, I mean, the misjudgment on all that by the Bush administration. As I said, going back to Wolfowitz before the House Budget Committee, they totally misjudged what they were getting into because they didn't understand Iraq. They didn't understand that Saddam Hussein represented a minority that had been running a country, beating down the Shia majority, and that this was going to open up a huge can of worms. And we've been wrong. I mean, we push elections on all these countries, and in almost every case, the people we want to win the elections don't win because we don't understand enough about what we're getting into.
You said in that same column on June 20th, how quickly would Congress have voted in October of 2002 on the eve of congressional elections to give President George W. Bush authority to use force in Iraq if the resolution had also contained a provision to raise taxes?
They wouldn't have voted for it.
June 6th, another column. Let's start with cost overruns, you write. Does any other branch of government get away with having its programs balloon the way Pentagon weapons systems do with no end in sight? What triggered you to write that?
I had had a long talk with a retired admiral who I had read somewhere that there is a program as part of developing a new weapon system. You had to make estimates on what the costs would be. And that he had told me that it was obviously a game, that everybody underpriced things. And then you have the whole problem of contractors who underpriced to win the bid. And then you have the whole problem that the Pentagon itself for years would make changes in weapon systems, which take years to build. And every time you make a change, the cost goes up.
Let's go back over that again. How can a contractor underprice something to win a bid and then get paid for the cost overrun? Isn't it built in that says you get...
Well, they've built it. They've tried over the years, and they've got a new one now. Ash Carter, who's the Deputy Defense Secretary, but when he was running procurement, they've tried to remedy all these programs. But it's hard to put your finger on who's major at fault, because particularly in the new weapons, which have these extraordinary electronic elements within them, that business is changing so fast that if you have a system that takes 5 years to build, maybe 3 years into it, there's a whole new technology that you want to integrate into it to make it better. Everybody wants to make it the perfect weapon. And so that every time, if you ever built a house, you decide you want a bathroom on the second floor and you didn't plan for it, cost the whole thing goes way up.
What's your personal philosophy about war in general?
I think it's a bad idea.
Always?
Well, it's not always, but again, I grew up with Senator Fulbright, whose view is, war is failed diplomacy, and diplomacy is reaching some consensus in which neither party claims victory. And it's harder and harder to do in societies where there's a form of democracy where your opponent could demagogue it. I was involved in a discussion the other day about Iran. And an Iranian I was talking to said, well, they'd offered things and got no response. And I said, between now and the election, President Obama couldn't make any agreement short of your government leaving and democracy taking over, because anything short of that would be used as a failure by the Republicans. Democracy's got some weaknesses in an age of instant communication.
Let me ask you about something that I know you've thought about this, and I've seen it for all the years I've been here. You speak positively about Senator Fulbright. And for those who don't even know the name, I know you wrote just recently about the Fulbright international program. Who was he?
Senator Fulbright was from Arkansas. Essentially, was a lawyer, was a Rhodes Scholar, went into politics when he was very young. The Fulbright program, which pays for a lot of exchange scholarship and exchange programs around the world, came out of an idea he had of using the excess money that came out of the Second World War that was owed to us by other countries to pay for this scholarship program. But he was in the House, then went to the Senate, and worked his way up and became chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee at a time when the committee was much smaller than it is now, and the staff was 16 people. And he studied foreign policy, and he went out of his way to talk to leaders that we disagreed with. I mean, he had, in the period I worked for him, which is the 60s and the Cold War, he regularly talked to the Russians, the Chinese, when nobody else did. And he said you had to understand the other side's point of view. And he had a committee that was understanding and bipartisan. I mean, both subcommittees I worked with, one was Senator Hickenlooper, who was a Republican, and the other was Senator Aiken, who was a Republican, agreed with everything we did. The first investigation, I went down, it was right after Rafael Trujillo, the dictator of the Dominican Republic, got assassinated. And I went down there, and this was investigating foreign lobbying. The first investigation, I came back with a whole bunch of material that showed Trujillo was paying money off to all sorts of people in this country and giving campaign contributions to both Democrats and Republicans. And we made it all public. The one thing we didn't make public when I found it was material that showed that Igor Cassini, the brother of Oleg Cassini, Jackie Kennedy's dress designer, had been secretly hired to get the sugar quota back for the Dominican Republic. And I gave it to the Senate, to the chairman. He brought Senator Hickenlooper in, and we reached agreement that we would give Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, 6 months to investigate and do what you had to do, because it was a clear violation of the law, or we would hold a hearing. Now you'd never get away with that now. And one of the great days I ever had was Fulbright called me up one day and said, Bobby Kennedy called him up, said he's going to be there at 3 o'clock the next day. He wanted to see him alone. And so I went down to the office, and I knew Bobby, and he walked in without saying anything. And at 3:30, Fulbright opened the door. Bobby had left by another exit and said, we talked about the poverty program for 25 minutes. And he looked up at the clock and he said, Igor Cassini is being indicted right now. Got up and left. I mean, you remember that. I mean, I was 29. You remember those things. You couldn't do that today.
What I wanted to ask you about, though, is tell me where I'm wrong about this, but the media in this town really liked J. William Fulbright because of his anti-Vietnam stance. Why then did they give him a pass, having signed the Southern Manifesto?
They actually didn't, and I used to have to go up to New York and defend myself all over the place. But not only on that, because he was then considered sort of anti-Israel. It was partly my fault. Because part of the investigation of foreign lobbying was the Jewish Agency for Israel, which was doing all sorts of things that they weren't supposed to do. It was a great lesson for me about, that you can't have everything. You want him in, I forget who the congressman was who didn't sign the manifesto, lost the next election from Arkansas.
Well, we ought to stop, though, and tell those that have never heard of the Southern Manifesto. 19 Democratic senators signed it. What was it?
Well, essentially, it was against the Civil Rights Bill and that the government ought to stay out of sort of amending all the terrible Jim Crow laws and education differentiation in the South.
They were against the Brown versus the Board of Education decision on the Supreme Court, didn't want the schools integrated.
Right.
I remember reading something where it said, we all get along down in the South, the race is white, we don't need to bring them together.
And Senator Fulbright made a long speech that what we have to do is increase the education for African Americans, and they weren't equal, they were separate, but they ought to be equal. And that was his argument. If you didn't say that, if you didn't sign the manifesto, you would lose your seat. So which is more important? It was one senator who was doing that, and he felt it was more important for him to stay in the Senate.
But where's the courage there? I mean, he's courageous being against Vietnam in a lot of people's eyes, but he's not courageous to bring his own people together down in Arkansas.
The two races that I know he ran, because I watched one of them, because it was in between. I agreed to come back after he was reelected. He was considered weak on civil rights. I mean, he was attacked by a total racist and just did win. So he wasn't considered strong enough. I mean, you look around today and take a look at the moderate Republicans, and they're all gone. So democracy has its issues, and you can't be perfect. And he understood it. There were a bunch of things he did that I disagree with. But, you make decisions in life. It's not perfect. And so I thought what he did in foreign policy was good enough for me, and important to have him there.
Back to a July 4th column that you wrote, on the way to BRAC savings, let me state it better, on the way to BRAC savings, a legion of cost overruns. I'll read this. In the latest of the 2005 BRAC program, BRAC is what?
Well, it's the program Congress passed to reach agreement on closing military bases, a very complicated thing in which the Defense Department picks out areas they want to close. They put together a commission to see and comment on the recommendations, and then Congress has to vote on it.
And they have to vote for the whole thing.
The
they
whole
can't
package.
pick it apart. Yeah. All right, let me read this sentence again. In its latest review of the 2005 BRAC program, the largest and most complex, the GAO, Government Accountability Office, found that the estimated cost of $21 billion to implement the program had grown to $35 billion by September 30th, 2011. Now that's in 6 years. It almost had doubled in what they told us it was going to cost to shut those bases down. Why?
Well, the example I picked was that the replacements, once Congress passed it, and everybody forgot about it. And so two things happened. One, as time passed, they underestimated the cost of the replacement just by the cost of living. But then, as I showed, I guess in one case, moving a school for people who want to get into West Point grew by 300 or 400% because when they decided to move it to West Point, the people at West Point wanted a much grander facility than the facility they left.
Have you ever seen?
And nobody paid attention to it.
Have you ever seen a time when one of these comes in way under budget? I mean, we see it day after day after day, over budget almost all the time.
Well, I think there are things that come under budget, but that's sort of our dealing with it. We are looking for the controversy. We're looking for the one that didn't work, and so we promote it. That the best example, which I always throw in, is the CIA, which gets beaten up for all its failures that get publicized, and almost never, you never hear about things that work.
I've seen you criticized for being the CIA's inside reporter at the Post. Fair criticism?
Probably. Once you, again, in this long period of time, I've just met a lot of those people. It is the most extraordinary life. They have given up, particularly the people who are in operations, they've given up normal life for what they're doing for the country. And the CIA works for the president, whoever the president is. And they get whipsawed when they do something as they did in Central America for Ronald Reagan. And the Democrats come in who didn't like what Reagan did, and they take it out on the agency. So you have that side of it, and to know the people, and I know some of the people who got caught up in that, Iran-Contra, and all these issues, where they were doing what they were told to do. I know people who were involved in the interrogations, and the number of times they went to the Bush administration to make sure they were doing something that was supposed to be legal. And they were continually reassured. And then, of course, when it was over, they all got investigated.
You said you knew George Tenet. Have you talked to George Tenet since he left the CIA about why he told the president there were weapons of mass destruction?
He was very upset about some of the pieces I wrote, raising questions about it. His agency was split. And he went with the people who sort of took the dark side of it. And
Did he say
just
why?
had a terrible impact on his life.
Did he say, how is he today?
Well, I think George, if he had his druthers, would like to be in public life. But instead he's in private life, doing very well, working for Allen and Company. And but I think he would have much rather have been in public life.
So let's pretend that you're at your desk and you get two different phone calls, given what you've told us as your own feelings about issues in war. And one of them is from somebody who's anti-Iraq and anti-Afghanistan. They want to leak you some information. And the other is pro, and they want to leak you some information. Which side do you take?
Not to be difficult, people don't call me up and tell me things. I read something and I call people up, but I've talked a lot about leaks. Column tomorrow is about leaks. Leaks are now part of government. In fact, I teach at Stanford. Stanford has a Washington program. I taught there for 10 years. I teach a course called Oversight of Government and the Media, although not too much oversight of government by the media. And what I teach them now more and more is that we are now in an era of government by PR. And so people just say things or leak things that's going to help their cause. The journalist who receives a leak or receives a classified document has to make a bunch of decisions. I mean, one of them is it true? And they always involve the government, so you have to inevitably go to the government. Most people don't understand we do that. When somebody leaks it, you go to the government, whatever government it is, so they get a chance to say something. Then you've got to decide whether it's newsworthy or not. Every secret isn't newsworthy. And then you've got to put it in some kind of context. And in the process of doing all that, you get a sense of why somebody's giving it to you. They're not doing it because you're the greatest questioner in the world or you're, a wonderful person. They want to get even with somebody. They want to give the other side of the story. They want something. But you really have to decide the first three things before you decide whether to print it or not.
Column on July 9th, battling IEDs has to be about more than money. It's all about subcontracting. I'll read this. But on June 29th, the Army awarded a contract for counterinsurgency targeting intelligence fusion and operations support in Afghanistan, Iraq, and elsewhere over 3 years. That contract could be worth more than $176 million. The contractor, quote, will support and augment, not replace government, military, and civilian personnel by integrating contract employees based on their skill sets into military, civilian intelligence operations according to the work statement. You go through a lot of stuff in this column, and then you write this. Bet your head is spinning right about now. There are so many deals and dollars flying about. That's a July 9th column, in case folks want to look it up on Washington Post.
It's this idea of contracting out the war, both in Iraq and Afghanistan, was a step taken because the Bush administration wanted to underplay what was going on. You mentioned General Shinseki and saying we need more people. This was one way to get around it. And then what you've created is an industry of people who used to do something while they were in service or working at the Pentagon, leave that job, go to a contractor, and end up in exactly the same post with higher pay, but sort of no guarantee of whatever their future is. And so that's now a big industry. There always used to be a concern about military people going into military contractors and helping. We now have a lot of companies started by military people and doing the same thing they did while they were in service.
But by the way, how much did you have to do with the Valerie Plame story?
It's a whole other. Lucky I went to law school. I wrote a story. I was writing a story about raising questions about weapons of mass destruction. And Joe Wilson, the former ambassador who worked in the Clinton administration, became critical of the Bush policy. Nick Kristof, the New York Times, wrote a column saying an American ambassador had checked out whether Saddam Hussein was trying to buy uranium from Niger and found out it was untrue, which had been part of the Bush argument about Saddam Hussein. So it took me, a month or so to find out who the ambassador was and to tell his story, and I agreed to tell it as a news story, but to leave his name out. And I did. And I was following up on that story and was raising questions of the White House about something going on that was associated with it. And in the midst of a conversation with Ari Fleischer, then George Bush's press secretary, he in effect said, "Why do you keep writing about Joe Wilson's trip? Don't you know it was set up by his wife who works for the agency?" I didn't know she worked for the agency. Nobody had ever told me. In writing my story, I had talked to Scooter Libby, who was the vice president's chief aide, about Cheney's role in all this, and he had never mentioned anything about Valerie Plame. And so I just put it in the back of my mind, and then at some point Bob Novak wrote a column exposing it. It became a big issue. And at a point after that, the Democrats, and I think Joe Wilson himself, raised the question about whether disclosure of her name had violated the law, which talked about disclosing the name of agents that were undercover publicly. And I looked up the law, and I had gotten a law degree, and I decided it didn't. And so I didn't write about it. I thought they were doing the wrong thing, and I wasn't going to put my thing out. But then in the fall, Congress started to investigate her. And it went to the CIA, and the CIA sent it to justice. And at that point, I co-wrote a story in which I said, or a Washington Post reporter, I didn't name myself, I co-wrote it with somebody about, had been contacted, but didn't think it broke the law. So when the special counsel started investigating the leaks, he had the wrong reporter originally, but then he came to me, and luckily my son is probably one of the best lawyers in town, and I used him, and we decided this was not a First Amendment issue, this was a criminal case. And through a whole group of machinations with the Post lawyer and my son and a whole bunch of things, I said I'd only disclose the name of my source if he came forward. And at a certain point, Fleischer went to the prosecutor and admitted that he had talked to me. At that point, I laid it all out to the prosecutor, and then and got Fleischer's lawyer's approval to talk to the prosecutor, and then I was subpoenaed to testify at the trial, and again, Fleischer's lawyers agreed that I could testify. The only issue was I testified that he had told me about Valerie Plame, and he had said he hadn't. He said he learned that he had told other people. So that's sort of where it stands.
We are unfortunately out of time. There's a lot more we could talk about. One last question. You got a book about all your life?
I have a wonderful editor that I promised years ago I'd write a book, and I went on a trip and wrote a 25-page outline and got about a third of the way through, and she still wants me to finish it, and maybe I will. It's just hard to find. I just write all the time, and you need extra time to do things like that.
Walter Pincus, since 1975 with the Washington Post, writing columns and stories, law degree from Georgetown, undergraduate degree from Yale. Thank you very much for joining us.
Oh, thank you.
For a DVD copy of this program, call 1-877-662-7726. For free transcripts or to give us your comments about this program, visit us at qna.org. Q&A programs are also available as C-SPAN podcasts.